it means a natural person, but not always. We jump into Canadian Law Dictionary and we basically see the same thing, but it gives us a better perspective on it. It goes, individual, a person under the Canadian Bill of Rights. The right of the individual extends to natural persons only. So that Canadian Bill of Rights we looked at, who did it apply for? Who did it protect? Natural persons only. Okay? That is, and when we don't even know we existed as that, what good is that statute? But when we know who we are, that statute's very powerful. And not to corporations. Okay? But it goes on to warn us again. The scope and meaning of individual has also been interpreted for other statutes. Bankruptcy Insolvency Act and the Income Tax Act. So we need, again, when we ever see the word, we can't just assume it's one thing or the other. We actually have to slow it down and check it out and try to support it. Here's a few more principles that you're going to need. Okay, whenever we see the word shall or may in statute, the expression shall is to be construed as an imperative, and the expression may as permissive. Okay, shall is must, may you can if you want. 15.1, 15.2 of the Canadian Interpretation Act. I'm going to touch on these. They're not going to make much sense until you see them actually in play, but I want to plant the seed so you'll see them when they come. So definitions or rules of interpretation in enactment apply to all provisions of the enactment, including the provisions that contain those definitions or rules of interpretation. So what they just said here is when you look in a statute and you see a bunch of words redefined in the act itself, like fair means moon and stuff, what they're saying is if in here you find this word, you don't run out here to the natural and ordinary meaning. You take this definition and drop it back in. So the words roll in on themselves. Again, once you see it in play, it makes a lot of sense, okay? But 15.2, he goes, where an enactment contains an interpretation section or provision, it must be read and construed as being applicable only if a contrary intention doesn't appear. You'll see how that plays in. Sometimes a word, if you actually try to take this meaning and drop it in, it would actually collapse the statute. It just wouldn't make sense. So there's times we can see that. But B is more important to remember, section 15.2b, as being applicable to all other enactments relating to the same subject matter unless a contrary intention appears. So after the break, we're going to be looking at the Income Tax Act and at the Excise Tax Act. What's the subject matter of both these acts? Taxes. So what they just said is all the words that are defined in the Income Tax Act by law carry their meaning into the Excise Tax Act. Okay, unless it's redefined, this word, say here, is redefined over here, then this doesn't carry over and it carries this meaning. And then vice versa. All the meanings in this act by law mean the same thing in this act. It doesn't happen that often, but this here is an important thing. Again, when we see it in play, it'll make a little bit more sense. Now here's about the most important thing that you need to, if you forget everything about all this principles of interpretation, rules of construction, just remember this one point. It is this single point was the whole reason of what happened in my court case. Why I didn't have to say a word. Okay? When I went into court and I kept beaking there and I said, but Your Honor, you know, I said, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be here. She goes, well, there's an order here that you're a natural person. There's an order here that you're a defendant. And I didn't really hear her say that, so I kept beaking again, and she goes, you know, I thought she said shut up or something, but she said, don't worry, sit down. Why would a judge at the beginning of a trial tell someone not to worry and just sit down? What did she know I didn't know? And we go through this permissible presumption, it really becomes so simple, it's hard to even accept. It's a very important permissible presumption that is perhaps the most frequently invoked, or at least has the greatest range of applicability, is the presumption against the interference with vested rights, your natural rights. Using the statute that declares the intention of Parliament is the Canadian Bill of Rights. Parliament has itself declared in effect that in the absence to the contrary by Parliament, in a prescribed form, an intention to infringe on human rights and fundamental freedoms must not be attributed to Parliament in any statute, whether it was enacted before or after the Bill of Rights. So one effect of the Bill of Rights, which applies only to who? Natural persons, is to prescribe a firm rule for the resolution of a conflict between the Bill of Rights and another statute. So what was the essence of my court case? There was an order that I was there as a human being, natural person, Canadian Bill of Rights. So what we had was a conflict between a natural person protected by the Canadian and the Income Tax Act. Who do you think is going to win? Well, she already knew what the law said. She goes, if the conflict is between a Bill of Rights and another statute, the Bill of Rights must, in all cases, prevail over the conflicting statute. That's why she said, don't worry, sit down. It was game over. So that's some tools you're going to need. We're going to have a break here. Memorize all that stuff so when we come back, we can go into these acts. Again, when you see it for yourself, we're looking to empower you with the knowledge of that. So let's have a 15-minute break, and we'll come back here. What we're going to do in the second half now is take what you learned in the first half. And again, you may not have memorized, but when you start seeing it being applied, it should come back to you. What we looked at the first half really is probably the most important aspect of all this is who you are in this legal system. Because you need to know that when we start looking at these laws. And so how do the laws actually relate to you? And what is it about your human rights that attaches you to these laws and stuff? So we're going to start focusing this into income tax. And we're going to look at the GST Act a little bit and at the Income Tax Act. So before we get into the acts, though, I want to go through a few of the questions that really are commonly asked, because it's amazing. We've all been trained by the same TV and the same media and the same things. We all end up with the same fundamental beliefs about income tax, right? So as the years progress, we started realizing there's really three main ones that we hear. Somebody, if you talk to somebody about this, go, well, what about this? What about this? So we're going to go through a few of them, and then we're going to go through some other aspects, too, before we get into it. Here's one question we hear a lot is, well, if we don't pay income tax, how will we run the country? Makes sense, right? Because what are we taught? It's our income tax that pays for everything, right? Well, the reality of it is there's like over almost 200 different taxes here. We're only talking about one or two of them here. The answer to this question is really simple. The way it was designed. Our government would print and issue currency based on the natural resource of this country, loan it to itself interest-free, and would collect import and export taxes as this nation's productions are sold. I mean, there's a lot of legitimate taxation structures in this country. Pay back the loan to itself, pay its operating costs, and anything left over would come back to the people in the form of services and dividends, all in balance with nature. That's why we say this is a great country. Our design is an excellent design. There is nothing really that needs to be changed at the structure of this country. We just need to see through illusion at the other end of it. To go further into this, though, we can support this through Canada's 1993 Auditor's General Report. They're talking about the cost of borrowing, or federal government borrowing money. So they go here, it goes from Confederation from 1867 to 1991-92, the federal government accumulated a net debt of $423 billion. That's a lot of money. We don't even relate to that reality, right? What is $1 billion? Okay, but it's a lot of money. Of this, though, only $37 billion represents the cumulative shortfall in meeting the cost of government programs since Confederation. So to run this country, we only actually really borrowed $37 billion to pick up the pieces. The remainder, the $386 billion, represents the amount the government has borrowed to service the debt created by previous annual shortfalls. So what happened? We relinquished the right to print and issue currency to the private bankers. We went to the private bankers to borrow money. We borrowed $37 billion, and well, we're stuck with $386 billion worth of interest costs. You think there's something going on here? And this story here really doesn't show you the true picture, because what it does, it goes back to 1867, but what we learned earlier was, yes, our country was founded in 1867. We did not have income tax for 87 years, I believe it is. 46 years, sorry. 46 years to 1913 is when the Bank Act was passed. At this point in time, our debt was $50 million. Not bad, right? We built a national railroad, pipeline, the whole bit. We even fought in wars, the whole bit. In 4 years, by 1917, after they relinquished the right to print and issue currency, this $50 million jumped to $2.2 billion. Okay, and now we're in 96, 97, it's $423 billion. Is it lower today? It was never designed. It was designed for the world bankers to get economic control over our country. And it's not the same thing, it's not an isolated thing to Canada. The same thing's in the States. In 1984, Ronald Reagan, he commissioned the Grace Report, because they were having suspicions about their income tax system too. And the basic conclusion of the whole report's on the website, but the conclusion basically is, with 2/3 of everyone's personal income tax wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by the interest on the federal debt and by the government's contribution to transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. So when someone says, how are we going to run our country? We'd run our country a lot better if we got rid of the income tax system, because that means we'd have to get rid of the private bankers. Again, Ronald Reagan, some great quotes over the years when he was alive. He goes, our federal tax system is, in short, utterly impossible, utterly unjust, and completely counterproductive. It reeks with injustice, and it's fundamentally un-American. It has earned a rebellion, and it's time we rebelled. And that's the president of a country. Who are they going to rebel against? The private bankers. So when we start seeing the real problems behind what income tax is, then we can start actually addressing it properly. Here's question 2. Actually, this is probably my favorite. You start laughing when you hear people. If we don't pay income tax, what about the roads? Since I started doing this, I've never met so many people who have a passionate connection to the roads. It's